Hi, this is Remembering the Past, the show where we talk about people who died recently who've had a profound effect on our history, our society, or our culture. We're going to start out tonight with Hopalong Cassady, not the cowboy, but the great running back from Ohio State, who died recently at the age of 85. He was one of Ohio State's Heisman Trophy winners in 1955 and was also the AP Athlete of the Year. 1954, he had a great season as well. He was third in the Heisman Trophy voting, and he helped Woody Hayes to his first national championship. So Hopalong Cassady is a legend at Ohio State, and here's the Big Ten Network to talk about him.
I'm Mike Hall with a BTN Live update. This Friday morning starts with sad news as a Big Ten legend has passed away. Howard Hopalong Cassady died this morning at 85 years old. He won a Heisman Trophy in 1955 with Ohio State and is widely considered one of the greatest to ever wear the scarlet and gray. Cassady was mostly known as an elite running back, but he did everything. Caught passes, returned kicks. He even was a defensive back. He helped win a national title in 1954, then went on to be the number 3 overall draft pick in the NFL and played there for 8 years. He is a Buckeye Hall of Famer, a college football Hall of Famer, and his number 40 is retired by Ohio State. Athletic Director Gene Smith said in a statement, "We've lost not only a legendary Buckeye, but also a wonderful person in Hop Cassady. He was an all-time great Buckeye in every way. We'll have the Cassady family in our thoughts and in our prayers."
Now, in 1957, when Hopalong Cassady was a senior, they had a freshman named Dick LeBeau. And let me tell you something, Dick LeBeau was one of the best defensive backs I ever saw for the Detroit Lions. He's in the Hall of Fame. He teamed with Yale Larry, whose podcast we've done, Night Train Lane, and Lem Barney. But here he tells a story about being a freshman at Ohio State in 1957 and what Hopalong Cassady meant to him.
The thrill of my freshman year was Hop Cassady's senior year. And of course, we all idolized Hop. His college career read like a Hollywood novel. Anything good that could possibly happen to an athlete at the most critical part of the game, it usually happened to Hop and for Ohio State. He had that knack of making the play. As we came through that season and were winding down, Hoppy was graduating, he took me into his locker and he said, "Dick, I want you to have this locker next year." I really hadn't spoken that much with Hop, but just admired him like the rest of us. And God, I can remember that day. I was so proud of that. And he wrote a little note to me in that locker about competing and never giving up, and the Buckeye spirit. When I graduated, I handed it on to a young freshman, and I knew it didn't have the impact of him handing it to me.
That's a football legend in his own right, talking about Hopalong Cassady. Well, as long as we're talking about sports, let's move on to the Chicago Cubs and WGN. Cubs have had a relationship with WGN television and radio for 72 years. I believe that's the longest in Major League Baseball, but they're leaving for some fancy, high-priced station, and they will no longer be heard or seen on WGN. Here's Lynn Bremer, the disc jockey from WXRT, with a tribute to the Cubs and WGN.
And now it's time to say farewell. The end of a baseball story that embraces generations, from grandfathers to grandchildren and beyond. For most of 70 years, when you said you'd be watching the Cubs, there was no need to search the TV guide. You watched them on WGN TV. You watched them on spring days when you came home from a rough day at school, and there they were. Your sun-splashed, hard-luck heroes running around a ballpark from a bygone era. But it wasn't only the kids from Portage Park and Lincolnshire. There were legions of Cub fans across the country who learned about this team because WGN reached into towns that had no team of their own. This is the story of images and voices that we will never let go. This is the song of Jack Brickhouse on opening day.
Hey! It's over! Willie Smith gets homered! The Cubs win the game!
This is the memory of a rainy afternoon against the Astros when Chip Carey and Steve Stone were in the booth for history.
Got him! 20 strikeouts!
There are random moments that make us smile because we hear the voice of Harry Carey, every bit as surprised by baseball as we are.
Sanchez. He never dropped one of those in his life.
What? He just did.
You did! Holy cow!
And when Andre Dawson put the barrel of the bat on the ball, Harry knew what was happening before it happened.
He did it!
There were lean years and a few glorious runs at a pennant. And when the dawn of a new age began, Len Casper and Jim DeShays were there to help us feel like kids again.
Deep left center! Game over!
The Cubs will debut on a new network that promises to be every bit as modern and eye-catching as the electronic scoreboards. But let us hope that we will still sing along with Steve Goodman. On behalf of all the people at WGN who ever pointed a camera or hooked up a mic or spoke to you of hopes and dreams.
There goes a runner. Out to win. What a lucky break. The good Lord wants the Cubs to win.
We thank you all for being the stuff of memories. Chicago Cubs got the greatest fans.
Well, we're going to move on from sports into ventriloquism and Jimmy Nelson, who died at the age of 90. In the Dark Ages, ventriloquism was black magic and people were put to death for doing it. But in the 1950s and 60s, it was pretty popular on television. My favorite was Senior Wences, the best with Arthur Worsley out of Britain. But Jimmy Nelson was great, and he was known for his dummies, Danny O'Day and the dog Farfel. And while they were great on television, their most famous bit was a Nestle's quick commercial. Here they are with Gordon McCrae.
Well, Danny O'Day, I didn't know you played football.
You didn't know I play? Are you joshing, Dad? Why, I play for the best of them. I made us play for Army, I made us play for Navy, and I made us play for Kim Novak.
Kim Novak?
Yes.
Wait a minute. That's not football, Danny.
You stick with your racket, and I'll stick with mine.
All right, I will.
Yes.
If you want me, I'll be over in the 50-yard line.
Yes. Cheers. Isn't he a nice guy?
He is a real swell fellow, Danny.
Yep. You know what I need right now?
What do you need?
Some of that Nestle everybody, the delicious instant cocoa.
You want some of that right now?
Yes.
All right, here you go. Be my guest.
Thanks a bunch. Dad, that's good.
You like that?
Yes.
Well, it's very good.
It's sensational.
Because it is Nestle's Ever-Ready, the delicious instant cocoa. And it's a complete cocoa,
I know. You don't have to tell me. Whole milk and sugar are already in it. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
All you have to add is water.
That's all you have to add, just water. And what a wonderful way to start the day. Look at that, a hot cup of energy-giving Nestle.
Match, Nelson, match. Because it's the only cocoa with that famous Nestle's chocolate flavor. Kids love it.
Well, I'll tell you a little secret.
What's that?
Grown-ups like it, too. And dogs love it.
Yes, I'll bet they do. Are you ready for our song, Farfel?
It's great singers.
Right, here we go. N-D-S-T-L-E-S, Nestle's make so very good.
Well, we're going to move on to Dr. Robert McClelland, who died recently at the age of 89. He was a surgeon in the University of Texas Health System, and he was an attending surgeon at Parkland Hospital on November 22, 1963, when he was called in to help take care of John F. Kennedy's wounds. Dr. McClelland was assisting Drs. Malcolm Perry and Charles Crenshaw with the tracheostomy that was performed by opening the exit wound on Kennedy's throat from Lee Harvey Oswald's second shot, the first one to hit Kennedy. Initially, they thought it was an entrance wound because it wasn't large, but later on they realized that it had to be an exit wound. McClelland was also the first one at the operating table to spot Kennedy's massive head wound, which he believed to be an exit wound, and he didn't believe that that wound came from a shot that was fired from the same place as the throat wound, which made him a darling of the assassination conspiracists. McClelland wasn't an assassination conspiracist, but he did believe that there was a conspiracy to kill Kennedy based on that wound.
But Dr. McClelland, again, your concerns are with that whole theory of even a single gunman. You think that, in point of fact, this may have been also done by someone who was shooting from the grassy knoll.
I think that's at least possible. And here again, there's no question that, as Dr. Jones says, that whether this was an entrance or an exit, this was a separate wound. And I think that there was a second bullet fired from the grassy knoll that blew out the back of his head. I don't think this bullet that came through here had anything to do with making that massive wound in the back of his skull. And that was low enough where I could see down into it and see the back part of the cranial cavity. And then when the cerebellum fell out, I could see even farther back into the skull. So this was a wound way back in the back of the skull, which is more consistent with a wound coming from the front and blowing out the back, the lower part of the back of the skull. Now, I'm sometimes asked, well, did you see an entrance wound that would be consistent with that big wound? And I have to say, no, I did not. And all I can speculate there, and I want to emphasize that's all I'm doing is speculating, that the wound that maybe came in from the front, from maybe the grassy knoll, and blew out the back of his head was perhaps hidden within the hairline And we didn't spend any time after he was pronounced dead looking at his head. His head was covered with blood, and the thick hair on his head very readily could have covered up a wound that entered about here and blew out the back of his head. That's my speculation. I emphasize that that's speculation.
And he says that's a different wound. He was talking about a different wound from the throat wound, and we know that to be true. He did not see an entrance wound in the head wound for a very simple reason. It would have been impossible for anybody shooting from the grassy knoll to shoot at an angle and trajectory to hit Kennedy in the front of the head without going through either the windshield or several passengers. And in fact, at autopsy, there was indeed an entrance wound found at the back of Kennedy's head indicating that he had been hit from the back. What Crenshaw and people don't understand is the massive wound in the back of Kennedy's head was not an exit wound so much it was a result of a bullet, a missile, traveling at a high speed through a closed container that was filled with liquid and semi-solid mass, which is what the skull and brain are. Almost like a rocket, the pressure builds up instantaneously and blew out the back of Kennedy's skull. And in fact, that phenomenon has been reproduced many times. A solid missile traveling through a closed container, coming in from the back, but blowing out the back as a result of the pressure buildup. In addition, Dr. McClelland was skeptical that John Connolly's wounds came from the same shot that went through John Kennedy's throat. John Connolly said that it wasn't the same shot that hit Kennedy, but almost certainly Connolly was remembering hearing the first shot, which didn't hit anybody, and then not realizing that the second shot went through Kennedy and hit him. And in fact, Connolly's wounds, which are well documented, could not have come from anywhere but from behind him through Kennedy, because the trajectory and angle of the bullet, again, would not have any other place it could have come from. Anyone who is skeptical about either of those two shots can just trace the trajectory of their proposed bullet, either from the grassy knoll or from somewhere else, and realize that it's impossible for it to come from there and be consistent with the evidence that was actually found. Dr. McClelland was also on duty 2 days later helping Dr. Tom Shires when Lee Harvey Oswald was shot by Jack Ruby. And here he describes the scene, and he gives a little more detail to the story of James Lavelle, whose podcast we just did a couple of weeks back.
And we got him out here and onto the table within probably 25 or 30 minutes from the time he was shot. And Dr. Shires nearly got down to where he could begin to do something and place clamps on the aorta and the vena cava, and then he arrested. That was about 30 minutes into the exploration, and we declared him dead. And so we went out, talked to Mr. Lovell, who was the deputy who was walking along beside him when he shot, and he was sitting out there by the coffee pot in the operating room waiting to find out what happened. So we came out and told him that we had not been able to save him. And so Mr. Lovell said, you know, as soon as he was shot and fell down to the floor, I got down on my hands and knees over him and put my face down in his, and I said, son, you're hurt real bad. Would you like to say anything to me now? And he said, Oswald, who had his eyes closed, opened his eyes real wide, looked up at him for a few long seconds, and then shook his head as far as he could from side to side, closed his eyes, and never opened them again. Mr. Lovell said, I'll think to the day I die that he was about to say something critical to me, but decided against it, and never did.
Jim Lavelle describes instinctively jerking Lee Harvey Oswald away from Jack Ruby, and by doing that, it altered the angle of the shot so that it hit the large vessels, the vena cava and aorta, which made it impossible to repair. Lavelle would have also been hit by the bullet were it not for the fact that it hit Oswald's rib and remained in his body. Well, I'm going to close on that note. I want to thank my producer and IT genius, Sid Tepps. We're going to close tonight with a brief mention of Robert Hunter, who died recently at the age of 78. He was a good friend of Jerry Garcia and the lyricist for the Grateful Dead. He didn't play, he stayed in the background, and no, I'm not a Deadhead. Actually, I don't like the Grateful Dead at all. But in the song Truckin', Robert Hunter wrote probably the most familiar lyric of the Grateful Dead, a lyric about a long, strange trip, and I think we have to include that.
Sometimes the light's all shining on me. Other times I can barely see. Lately it occurs to me